The first thing I remember is the sound of paper hitting the table, a sharp smack that cut straight through the warmth of my mom's dining room. Through the smell of cinnamon rolls she always made on New Year's Day, through the small talk none of us really cared about. I looked up just in time to see Chloe's hand still hovering over the stack. Her voice did not even shake when she said it. The best gift is when you're gone. For a second, no one breathed. My dad's spoon froze halfway to his coffee. Ethan shifted his weight behind Chloe like he wanted to stand taller, but could not, risk drawing attention. My mom pressed her napkin flat against her lap and stared at it like the pattern had suddenly become fascinating. And me, I just sat there with my hands still wrapped around a mug that had gone cool. Before Chloe said another word, a part of me knew this moment had been waiting in our family for a very long time. I had opened the morning with something as harmless as a question. It is the new year. Does anyone have any wishes for it? The kind of thing people say to keep the room soft and easy. But the silence that followed was thick and reluctant, like everyone was waiting for someone else to speak first. I noticed the way my mom's eyes slid toward Chloe and then away, the way Ethan could not decide where to look, the way even the steam rising from the coffee felt like it was pulling away from me. Something was off, and had been off long before that morning. Before I go any further, let me pause for a moment. I always like knowing what people are doing when they listen to stories like this. It makes the world feel a little closer, a little more human. So if you feel like sharing it later, tell me what kind of moment you are in right now. When all of this happened, I was sitting at that table feeling the air around my shoulders turn cold even, though the house itself was warm. Chloe pushed the papers closer to me with the edge of her palm. Sign everything over. The house, the business, every asset you have. You do not deserve any of it anyway. She said it so casually, like she was reminding me about returning a borrowed sweater. Ethan stood behind her with his arms crossed and his chin slightly lifted as if to signal he agreed with every word she had spoken. I did not answer right away. I reached for the papers, unfolded the top sheet, and let my eyes skim the words. Transfer of ownership. Immediate relinquishment of authority, assumption of liabilities. It was all there, properly typed and notarized, the kind of paperwork someone had spent weeks preparing. She had not made this decision last night in a fit of anger. This was planned, rehearsed, sharpened. My dad finally set his spoon down but still would not look at me. His head stayed bowed as if he was praying for the moment to pass. My mom lifted her eyes only once. And when she did, there was a brief flicker of something that looked like an apology, but it vanished before I could be sure. No one stood up for me. No one told Chloe to stop. No one pushed the papers away. So I asked a single question. What exactly am I agreeing to take responsibility for? My voice was calm and low, almost bored, as if we were talking about the weather and not the destruction of an entire life, had built piece by piece. Chloe laughed, a short, breathy sound that was more contempt than humor. Oh, please, Clara. You always act like things are so complicated. It is all written there. Just sign. You say you want peace. Fine. Give it to all of us, too. I flipped to the last page. The signature line waited for me like a dare. Part of me expected my hand to shake. It did not. The room felt strangely quiet. Like all the sound had been pulled beneath the floor. I felt my heartbeat slow, not speed up. I picked up the pen, uncapped it with a soft click, and signed my name with the same handwriting I had used on every document for the last company I founded, the home I bought, the debts I had paid for the whole family over the years. When I finished, I pushed the papers back across the table. No problem. Consider it done. Even Ethan blinked. Chloe's mouth fell open before she caught herself and closed it quickly, smoothing her expression into triumph. My dad's head jerked slightly, as if he had not expected me to go through with it. My mom's lips parted, but no words came out. The silence that filled the room was not relief. It was confusion, suspicion, maybe even fear. They had prepared for a fight. They had sharpened their words and readied their arguments. They had not prepared for surrender. But it was not surrender. Not really. Chloe snatched the papers up with shaky fingers, as if worried I might suddenly change my mind. She slid them into a large envelope and tucked it protectively against her chest. Good. This will be better for all of us. You will see. Her voice softened for the first time that morning, but it was not kind. It was satisfying. I stood from the table, my chair scraping softly against the hardwood. No one moved to stop me. No one asked if I was all right. No one said thank you. As I stepped back from the table, I looked at each of them, really looked. And something settled inside me that had been restless for years. That signature did not make me smaller. It did not take anything from me that I was not already preparing to let go. What it did was mark the end of a role I had been playing since I was barely old, enough to understand what family loyalty meant. It freed me in a way none of them could have predicted. My dad finally glanced up, but the moment our eyes met, he dropped his gaze again. My mom folded her napkin into a smaller and smaller square until her hands were trembling. Ethan shifted from foot to foot like a man who suddenly realized he had not thought far enough ahead. And Chloe, clutching that envelope like a trophy, smiled without seeing anything at all. I walked toward the hallway slowly, not rushing, not hiding, letting each step become part of the choice I had made long before the papers hit the table. Their voices rose behind me, quiet at first, then louder, overlapping in confusion. They wanted to ask something, or maybe explain, or maybe backtrack. But I did not turn around. I paused at the doorway long enough to feel the shape of the moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing against my spine. For years, I had carried this family like a full suitcase I never set down. That morning, I finally did. I stepped outside into the cold New Year air and closed the door gently behind me. The sky was pale and strangely bright, the kind of winter light that makes everything look cleaner than it really is. My breath formed a thin cloud in front of me as I let the silence settle. It was the first silence in a very long time that belonged solely to me. What none of them knew, what they could not have imagined, was that I already understood exactly what would happen next. Signing those papers was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs, and Chloe, so certain she had won, was about to learn what she had truly asked for. But that is the part that comes later. For now, all you need to know is that I left that table lighter than I had been in years, finally aware that the strongest thing I had ever done was simply walk away. And that is where the real beginning sits, waiting quietly just past the doorway I closed behind me. I walked down my mom's front steps with the cold air pressing against my face, feeling strangely weightless, as if something I had been carrying for years had finally slipped off my shoulders. I reached my car, opened the door, and sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel. For a long moment, I simply breathed, letting the quiet settle around me. And as the silence deepened, my mind drifted back, not to the moment Chloe slammed those papers on the table, but to the years that made that moment possible. The years when I learned exactly what role I had been assigned in that family. People assume a role is something you step into knowingly, like choosing a career path or falling in love with a hobby. Mine was quieter, slower, something that grew around me until I could not tell where I ended and where obligation began. I was 22 when I opened the business. It was supposed to be a small logistics firm in Austin. Nothing extraordinary, just enough to pull me out of the endless retail jobs I had worked through in college. My plan was simple: build something small but stable, pay my own bills, live quietly. I did not know that the moment I succeeded, everything in my life would shift. The first time my parents asked for help, it was framed as temporary. They were behind on the mortgage, just a few months, and the bank had been calling. I remember sitting at their kitchen table, running numbers on a napkin, thinking I could cover it this once. I transferred the funds that afternoon, told them not to worry, and believed it when they promised they would get back on their feet soon. They never did. Or maybe they never tried. That part took me longer to understand. Once I paid the mortgage, the next request did not feel surprising. A medical bill, then another. Then my dad's truck needed repairs. Then Mom's credit card interest was getting out of hand. None of it felt dramatic at the time. It was just another month, another need, another small fire only I seemed capable of putting out. Every crisis arrived in soft voices. We hate to ask. If we had anyone else. You have always been so good with money. Each time I convinced myself I was just being a good daughter. Chloe's first call for help came not long after she married Ethan. They had fallen behind on their rent and were worried about eviction. I went to meet them at a diner on the south side, the kind with torn booths and burnt coffee. Chloe wore a brave face, but she kept picking at the peeling laminate on the table. Ethan let me explain the options as if he were only half listening. I offered to cover the rent for 2 months and help them budget. They nodded gratefully, promised to do better. And 2 months later, asked again. One winter, I lost count of how many times I transferred money. It was easier than arguing. I was the one with the business. I was the one who always figured things out. And if something went wrong in the family, I absorbed it. If a bill was late, I caught it. If someone made a mistake, I fixed it quietly behind the scenes. The first large crisis hit when Chloe tried to start an online boutique. She ignored shipping costs, miscalculated taxes, and at one point promised pre-orders she had no inventory for. By the time she came to me in tears, she owed vendors more than she had ever earned. I spent 3 nights rebuilding her spreadsheets, negotiating with suppliers, and paying the outstanding balance myself. She hugged me afterward, told me she did not know what she would do without me, and for a few hours I felt valued. It is astonishing what a single thank you can do when you have been running on empty. The business grew faster than I expected. With growth came responsibility. Contracts, payroll, insurance, overhead. My days blurred into weeks, and my weeks into years. Whenever my dad needed a copay for a specialist, I paid for it. Whenever Chloe and Ethan struggled, I picked up the tab. The role became so natural that no one ever stopped to ask how I was doing, what I needed, or whether I was tired. I remember one night vividly. It was late summer, humid and restless. We were at a family dinner at a steakhouse near downtown Austin. The check arrived and it sat there for exactly 3 seconds before Chloe slid it toward me with a laugh. You know we would be lost without our Clara. The whole table chuckled, even my parents. And I smiled because it was easier than letting the sting show. That was the moment I realized the joke was not a joke at all. It was truth disguised as humor. They depended on me, but not in the soft, loving way families often do. It was dependence edged with entitlement. The business hit its first major downturn when a supplier overseas mishandled a shipment. We lost a contract that had supported nearly half of our revenue. I spent sleepless nights calling distributors, renegotiating deals, tightening every financial valve we had. I did not tell my family any of it. I knew exactly what would happen if I even hinted at struggling. They would panic, not for me, but for themselves. How will we pay the mortgage? How will you help Chloe this month? How will my dad cover his pills? There was no room for my failure. Not in the role I had been given. Still, when Chloe came to me that winter with another emergency, I said yes. She and Ethan had taken out a personal loan they could not pay. The interest was climbing. I went to the bank with them, sat beside Chloe while she cried, and signed as guarantor so the rates would drop. I told myself I was doing the right thing. Later, I realized I had simply made it easier for them not to change. There were moments, small at first, when I wondered what would happen if I stepped back, if I let them solve their own problems. But each time the thought surfaced, guilt wrapped itself around my ribs. My mom's voice in my head. We are family. The family takes care of each other. But it was never each other. It was always me taking care of them. The strange part was how invisible the pattern became. At birthdays, holidays, and cookouts, everyone behaved like this was the natural order of things. I was the strong one, the reliable one, the one who could handle anything. And when you carry that label long enough, it starts to sound like love, until it doesn't. The first crack in that illusion came one evening when I overheard something that was not meant for me. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop off groceries. As I walked in, I heard Chloe speaking to my mom in the living room. She was frustrated, angry about something Ethan had done, and she blurted out the truth without meaning to. Clara will fix it. That is what she is for. They laughed, a light, careless laugh. And I stood in the hallway, holding a bag of oranges, like they had suddenly become unbearably heavy. That was the moment I understood the shape of the role I had been playing. Not a daughter, not a sister, not equal. Utility, the one they called in emergencies, the one who kept everything from falling apart, the one who absorbed damage so no one else had to feel it. It took me months to accept it. Years to understand what it had cost me. And standing in the doorway of my car after leaving that New Year's table, the memory of that laugh returned with a clarity that felt almost cruel. The truth was simple. Their affection, their gratitude, their warmth, all of it was conditional. It lasted only as long as I remained useful. And the moment they believed they could take what they wanted without needing me anymore, they did. I sat there in my car on that cold morning with my breath fogging the windshield and felt something shift inside me. I was done waiting for recognition, done hoping for reciprocity, done pretending that my value in that family was rooted in love rather than convenience. The realization settled over me like a blanket. It did not hurt. It simply clarified everything. For the first time in my life, I let myself admit the truth. I had been born into a role I never chose, and I had stayed in it far too long. But that morning, walking away from the table where Chloe declared her wish for my absence, I chose something different. I chose not to wait for anyone to see me. I chose to see myself. Those words lingered in my mind as I sat in the car that New Year's morning, the engine still off, the cold seeping through the window glass. And that choice, the one I finally made after years of carrying everyone else's weight, traced itself back to a day 6 months earlier. A day when a doctor looked at me with careful eyes and said the kind of thing people avoid saying out loud. It had started with a dull ache under my ribs. Nothing sharp, nothing dramatic. Just enough to make me pause at my desk and lean forward, pressing my hand to my side. My office in Austin had been quiet that afternoon. The rest of the team was out meeting a client, and I stayed behind to catch up on payroll and vendor contracts. I remember thinking it was probably just stress or one too many cups of coffee. By the next morning, the ache was still there, and a strange heaviness had settled in my stomach. At the urging of one of my managers, I scheduled an appointment at a clinic near downtown. It was supposed to be routine. A blood test, maybe some scans. Nothing life-changing. I even brought my laptop to answer emails in the waiting room. The doctor's voice was calm when she came back with the results, but there was a tightness around her mouth that told me the news was not simple. She explained that the scans had shown a mass in my abdomen. Not tiny, not enormous, but concerning. She talked slowly, describing biological markers and irregular borders. Words like suspicious and advanced but not definitive passed between us like quiet stones. "We need to do a biopsy," she said softly. "Soon." My mind went blank for a moment, the way a computer screen freezes just before shutting off. I nodded, because that was what people did when doctors spoke in slow, steady sentences. But inside, something cold began to form. Not panic, not fear, just a stillness. Like the moment before a storm hits. When I left the clinic, the sun was too bright. I remember blinking at it like I no longer knew what time of day it was. I sat in my car with the biopsy referral paper in my hand, folding it and unfolding it as if the words might rearrange themselves into something harmless. But they did not. The first person I told was my mom. I expected comfort, or at least concern. Instead, she put her hand on mine and whispered, "You have always been fragile. Let us handle things from here." My dad said something similar when he joined us, that he always knew I pushed myself too hard, and this was my body forcing me to slow down. Chloe took it further. She said maybe this was a sign I needed to stop trying to control everything. She did not mean to sound dismissive, but it came out that way. What struck me most was the immediate shift. Before I even understood the diagnosis, they had already placed me back into the child's chair. They spoke over me, around me, for me, as if I had already disappeared. As if my voice no longer mattered because sickness had touched me. Their concern felt like a soft blanket that tightened around my ribs the more they insisted I rest and let them take over. The biopsy was scheduled for the following week. The night before, I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the old air conditioner. The fear of the procedure itself did not unsettle me. What unsettled me was the possibility that they were right. That I was fragile. That I could not handle this alone. Maybe I was not as strong as I believed. The morning of the biopsy, I drove myself to the imaging center. The nurse asked if someone was there to pick me up afterward. I said yes, even though there was not. The test was uncomfortable, but not unbearable. When it was over, I sat in the small recovery room drinking water from a paper cup, thinking about how odd it was that my life might be splitting into a before and after without any fanfare. 2 days later, the doctor called. Her voice was gentle but not celebratory. The results were inconclusive. The mass looked aggressive, but was not confirmed. My markers were concerning, but not definitive. The next steps involved monitoring, repeated imaging, and possibly another biopsy in a few months. Nothing urgent, she said, but nothing to ignore. I hung up the phone and stood in the middle of my living room with my hand pressed against the cold countertop. The house was quiet. I could hear the neighborhood children yelling somewhere down the street. My phone buzzed on the counter with a message from Chloe asking if I had a chance to cover the loan payment due that month. She ended the message with a heart emoji, as if affection could soften the request. It was in that exact moment that everything inside me shifted. The possibility of sickness did not frighten me nearly as much as realizing how quickly my family had been willing to take away my autonomy. They wanted to handle things. They wanted to take charge. But not out of love. Out of convenience. A sick me was easier to manage than a strong me. I realized that if I were to disappear one day, whether by illness or exhaustion, they would not lose me. They would lose the services I provided. That was the day the role finally showed itself in full. Over the next few weeks, I found myself organizing documents like a person, preparing for a departure. I updated my insurance forms. I reorganized my business records. I created a binder of passwords and instructions for the operations team, not because I expected to die, but because I wanted the choice. If I ever had to leave the life I had built, I wanted it to be on my terms. I even drafted a letter to my parents, explaining the business structure and where certain accounts were held. I never intended to give it to them. Writing it was simply a way of admitting to myself how much I had carried without acknowledgement. My health follow-up appointment was scheduled for 3 months later. I did not tell anyone about it. Not my family, not my staff, not even my closest friend Dana. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed something to belong entirely to me, a secret that felt less like a burden and more like a boundary. During that period, I began noticing moments I had overlooked before. The way my mom referred to me as the dependable one, but never asked how I was really doing. The way my dad relied on my financial help, but changed the subject whenever I tried to talk about feeling overwhelmed. The way Chloe shrugged off my exhaustion, insisting that I was better at handling stress than she was. It was not that they meant harm. It was that they did not see me at all. They saw what I did, what I provided, what I fixed. Illness or not, that truth landed in my chest with a heaviness I could not shake. Around this time, I started going on long evening drives. I would leave the office after my staff had gone home and take the winding roads out toward Lake Travis. Windows down, radio low, the Texas air thick but steady. Driving gave me space to think, to breathe, to imagine a life that was not built around being useful. I wondered what it might be like to disappoint people on purpose, to say no without explanation, to stop trying to outrun their expectations. The possibility of sickness did not push me toward despair. It pushed me toward clarity. If my life could change in an instant, if a doctor could call me one day and tell me the mass had grown and time was red, suddenly limited, then I wanted to spend whatever days I had left living a life that belonged to me. That thought stayed with me. Quiet but persistent. A small flame in a dark room. By the time the follow-up appointment approached, I felt strangely calm. Not hopeful, not afraid. Just steady. I took the day off from work, something I rarely allowed myself to do. I walked through my house slowly the night before, touching the back of the dining chair, the edge of the counter, the framed photograph of me and my parents at a 4th of July picnic, a decade earlier. I tried to remember what it felt like before the responsibilities piled up, before the business grew, before I became the person everyone leaned on. The next morning, I drove to the clinic with the sun rising behind the buildings, casting long shadows over the highway. Once inside, the nurse guided me to a familiar room. As I waited for the doctor, I stared at the little sink in the corner, the same one where I had washed my hands after the biopsy. It struck me how ordinary everything looked, as if life-altering conversations always began in small, sterile rooms no one decorated. The doctor came in with a gentle smile. She explained the monitoring plan, the need for continued observation, the fact that although the markers remained concerning, there was no definitive diagnosis. Not yet, not today. She used words like manageable and cautious optimism. I nodded, absorbing each phrase without letting any particular emotion take hold. When she left, I gathered my things, walked to my car, and sat there with the weight of the non-verdict settling inside me. I was not dying. Not yet. But I was not entirely safe either. I was suspended between two possibilities, neither of which offered certainty. As I started the engine, I felt the same cold stillness I had felt 6 months ago. Only this time, I understood it. My life was not defined by illness. It was defined by the choices I would make with or without it. The diagnosis had not taken anything from me. It had clarified the truth that had been waiting quietly in the background. By the time I pulled out of the parking lot, I knew one thing for certain. Whether the mass grew or remained stable, whether it turned out to be dangerous or harmless, I would no longer let anyone take control of my life under the guise of protecting me. The illness was not the story. It was simply the spark that made the rest of the story possible. That truth followed me through the winter like a second shadow, quiet but always present. And by the time New Year's morning came, and Chloe slammed those papers in front of her, me, I already knew exactly what I was doing when I signed them. What I did not know was how quickly everything around me would shift once the ink dried. The day after the signing felt strangely ordinary at first. I woke up before sunrise, made coffee in the kitchen of the house I no longer technically owned, and sat by the window listening to the early traffic hum down the street. My phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter, lighting up with messages from Chloe. She sent photos of herself in the driveway, standing in front of my house with the envelope held high like a silver medal. Then a picture of Ethan leaning on my car, grinning. Then one of her inside my living room, her feet on my coffee table, a caption below it saying something like, "Final." I stared at each photo only long enough to register it, then set the phone face down. By noon, she called. When I answered, her voice was bright in a way that felt deliberately exaggerated. "Just checking in, Clara. Hope you are doing well. We stopped by the house last night. It looks even better when it is ours." She was laughing, and in the background I could hear Ethan talking about paint colors and how he wanted to redo the kitchen. It was as if the home I had maintained for years had instantly become theirs playground. I told her I was fine, that I hoped they enjoyed it. She hesitated for a second, surprised that I was not arguing, then ended the call quickly, promising to reach out soon. What she did not know was that while she was celebrating, I was already somewhere else entirely. I drove to the office that afternoon and walked straight to Dana's desk. She looked up from her computer with the expression of someone expecting trouble. I had emailed her the night before with one sentence: "Initiate everything we discussed." She stood as I approached, closing her office door behind us once we stepped inside. "Are you sure, Clara?" Her voice was quiet but steady. Sometimes people hesitate once things become real. I shook my head. No hesitation. She nodded, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folder. "Everything is ready. I need your signature on these to finalize your withdrawal from executive authority. The language makes it clear that Chloe and Ethan assume responsibility for all operational decisions from this point forward. Your CFO is on standby to transfer access once we send the notice." I ran my thumb along the edge of the folder, feeling the smooth paper beneath it. I had spent months preparing for this possibility, months adjusting contracts, redistributing authority, training my senior staff to operate without me. At the time, it felt like caution. Now I understand it as instinct. I picked up the pen and signed each page, the same looping signature I had given away at my mom's dining table only 24 hours earlier. When I finished, Dana exhaled slowly. "Do you want to write a statement for the team? They are going to notice you." Stepping back. "Tell them I am focusing on long-term strategy. No details. No timeline. They know how to handle the day-to-day." She nodded again. There was something like admiration in her eyes, or maybe relief. I walked out of her office with my shoulders lighter than I remembered them ever being. From there, I found Melissa in the finance wing. She was reviewing quarterly projections and looked up with a small frown when she saw me. "You sure about this, boss?" I smiled. That title does not really apply anymore. She snorted softly. "You will always be the one who built this place. No amount of paperwork changes that." She showed me the accounts, the automated transfers, the passwords she would disable once Ethan tried to access them. He had already emailed her that morning asking for payroll login information and vendor contracts. It did not surprise me. He had been circling the company for years, like someone waiting for his chance to decide what it should be. As Melissa walked me through the final steps, she paused and looked at me carefully. "You know they have no idea what they are taking on. Your sister especially." "I know. They think this is winning." I nodded. Let them believe it for now. I left the office just before sunset. The sky over Austin was streaked with orange and fading blue, the kind of sky that made everything look softer than it really was. My phone buzzed again as I reached my car. Another message from Chloe. We told Mom and Dad. They agree it was the right decision. You really did the mature thing by signing. The message ended with 3 heart emojis. For a moment I stared at the screen, feeling no anger, no sadness. Just distance. A distance that felt earned. The next morning began the same way the last one had, with messages and photos and a breathless excitement from Chloe that bordered on manic. She and Ethan had moved boxes into the house already, even though nothing formal had been transferred beyond the paperwork she clutched. They posed in my kitchen, my living room, even my backyard. Each photo had the same tone, the same underlying message. Look what we took. By midday, I turned my phone off. The silence that followed was different from the silence in my family's dining room. This one felt clean, uncluttered, almost warm. I sat in my living room at my apartment in Austin, the one I kept quietly under my own name, and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of someone walking their dog outside, the light clicking of my own breathing. It was the first day in years when no one asked for money. No one asked for help. No one expected me to fix something. That calm lasted for almost an hour until the doorbell rang at my old house. Not mine anymore. Chloe texted later to say she had stopped by to measure the living room for new furniture. I did not reply. The shift came 3 days after the signing. The mail at the house began to arrive in thick envelopes marked urgent, but they were not addressed to me. They were addressed to Chloe and Ethan. Notices regarding outstanding loans, deferred payments, tax liabilities, vendor accounts with pending reviews. For years, those envelopes had come to me, each one a little warning bell. Now they were landing squarely at the feet of the people who believed they had claimed victory. Melissa sent me a picture of one envelope that had been forwarded incorrectly to the office. She wrote one sentence. They are about to learn. It was not spite that made me read her message twice. It was clear. Every responsibility they assumed without understanding was now theirs in full. Every contract they had ignored when I tried to explain it was now arriving in black and white. I had not set a trap. I had simply stepped out of the one I had been in for years, and the void left behind told the truth. Later that afternoon, I drove to the lake and parked near the water. The wind was cool and steady, rustling through the leaves of the cypress trees. I sat there with the window cracked open and let the breeze brush against my cheek. For the first time since signing everything away, I felt the weight of my own breath, the softness of it, the steadiness. I thought about the way she used to sit beside me when we were children, leaning her head on my shoulder when she was scared. I thought about how that bond had stretched and thinned, and finally snapped under the weight of her own ambition. I wondered if she knew that the moment she pushed those papers across the table, she had ended something that had once mattered deeply to both of us. As the sun dipped lower, my phone buzzed again. I had turned it back on briefly to check emails, and now there were messages from my parents. My mom asked if I could call her. My dad sent a simple question. Was this really what you wanted? I stared at the screen for a long time before setting it aside. I would answer them eventually, but not today. Today, I let the noise fall away. Back at my apartment that evening, I made dinner for myself. Nothing elaborate, just salmon and steamed vegetables. The simplicity felt luxurious. As I sat at the table, I realized how little space my own life had taken up in recent years. It had always been overshadowed by crises, demands, obligations. Now, in the stillness of that quiet apartment, I felt the shape of my life returning to me. Before going to bed, I placed my phone in a drawer and closed it. Not angrily, not dramatically, just with a sense of finality. I did not need to see any more messages from Chloe or Ethan or anyone else. The world could wait. As I turned off the lights, a calmness settled into my chest that I had never known before. The silence was no longer frightening. It no longer felt like abandonment or loneliness. It felt like a room I had finally walked into, a room that had been waiting for me all along. And in that quiet, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. Everything was moving exactly as it needed to move. That thought settled into me like a steady pulse. And for the first time in years, I felt no urge to check my phone. No instinct to fix, to soothe, to anticipate someone else's crisis. The world outside my apartment felt strangely distant, and for a brief stretch of days I let myself drift through my own routine, quiet and uninterrupted. It did not last long. Reality has a way of knocking on doors even when you refuse to answer. On the fourth morning after I signed everything over, my email pinged with an automated notification from the company accounts. I had set it to copy me on certain correspondence, even though I no longer held executive authority. One line in the subject made me pause. Past due vendor invoice. I opened it out of habit, then reminded myself that it was no longer my problem. That responsibility now belonged entirely to Chloe and Ethan. Still, I read the report, then closed my laptop and went to make breakfast. An hour later, my phone began vibrating inside the drawer where I had left it. It buzzed so many times the wood rattled. I ignored it. Eventually, it stopped. When I finally checked my voicemail that evening, Chloe's voice filled the room in frantic bursts. "Clara, call me. There is something wrong with the accounts." Another message said something about a bank calling. Another mentioned a letter she did not understand. In the last, she whispered that Ethan was getting nervous and she did not know what to tell him. I deleted all of them. The next day I went for a long walk on the trail near the river. Families were out with strollers, cyclists passed with quiet bells, and the air smelled like cedar. It was peaceful. Almost painfully peaceful. My phone stayed silent until midday. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the calls came again. Every few minutes. Chloe's number. Ethan's number. My parents' house. I let each one fade to voicemail and kept walking until the sun dipped low. That evening, Melissa called from the office. I answered because she only called when it mattered. Her tone was careful. "We got a strange request from your sister today. She wanted access to payroll certifications and supplier histories. She said she was planning to restructure." I smiled at the ceiling. "And did you give it to her?" "Of course not. She does not have clearance, even with ownership. Not without board acknowledgement." She got upset. The words are direct, but there was something like concern beneath them. "Are you doing all right?" I told her yes. She hesitated, then added quietly, "This is going to get messy for them, I know." The next morning I woke to my phone buzzing again. I let it ring until it stopped. Later, when I checked the screen, I saw a long string of messages. Chloe had forwarded photos of envelopes from lenders. She had circled lines in a red pen, demanding explanation. One message read, "I thought you handled all this." Another said, "Why would you leave this for us?" It was the first time she had ever implied she depended on me. It landed oddly, somewhere between accusation and confession. By late afternoon, she sent a text that was clearly typed in a hurry. One of the loans lists Ethan and me as responsible parties. It says we assumed the obligation. Did you sign something like that? I sat on my couch with the light fading over the living room, letting the words sink into me. It was the first moment I sensed something deeper taking hold in her. Not anger, not triumph, but dawning understanding. The terms she had demanded I sign had tied her to every liability she thought she was escaping. What she thought she had inherited was never simply a house or a business. She had inherited the weight I had carried for years. She just did not know how heavy it was until it shifted onto her shoulders. That night she called again. This time I let the voicemail play on speaker while I washed dishes. Her voice cracked. "Clara, please, I need to talk to you. I do not know what any of this means. Ethan is upset. The bank said there is a review because of something with a guarantor clause. I do not even know what a guarantor clause is." Her breath hitched. "Why did you never tell me about this?" I turned off the faucet and stood still for a moment. She wanted honesty, but not the kind she had earned. She wanted rescue without accountability. I set the phone aside and let the room fall back into silence. The next day was worse for them. I went to the grocery store early in the morning, and while choosing tomatoes, I felt my phone vibrate repeatedly. New messages from my mom and my dad appeared in quick succession. Mom wrote, "Chloe is upset. Can you call her and calm her down? He wrote that your sister said there are bills. Did you forget to tell her something?" The words were gentle, but full of the same expectation they had always held, that I would step in, handle it, make it easy for them. I put the phone back in my pocket without replying. Around lunch, I got an email from one of our longtime vendors. It was addressed to Chloe, but copied to my old executive inbox. It stated politely that payment was overdue for an order placed 3 months ago, and that because the business had transferred ownership, the responsibility now rested exclusively with the new owners. There was a quiet finality in the wording. They were informing her, not asking. I closed the email and stepped outside to sit on my apartment balcony. The winter light was pale and soft, the sky a washed-out blue that made everything look distant. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and listened to the faint hum of the city. For the first time in a long time, I was not bracing for impact. I was simply watching the consequences move where they belonged. By the end of that week, Chloe's messages had shifted from frustration to panic. She sent a photo of a document from the Texas Department of Revenue with a yellow flag in the corner. Something about a filing discrepancy from last year. I remembered the issue. It had been resolved by an auditor after weeks of phone calls, but the system had flagged it when she changed the company registration. I ran my finger along the edge of my coffee mug and felt a strange calmness. I had not left anything unfinished. I had kept it afloat. She had simply never noticed how many fires I had put out before they spread. That night, the calls changed tone. Instead of pleading, Chloe's voice carried anger braided with fear. You tricked me. You signed over something broken. You left me with problems you knew I could not handle. I listened to the voicemail without reacting. She was not entirely wrong, but she was not right either. I had not broken anything. I managed it. She had just never seen the work behind the surface. Later that same evening, I received a message from Ethan. It was short. Explain the loan terms. We cannot afford this. There was no greeting, no question mark, no courtesy. Only demand. For a moment, I considered replying with something simple. You wanted ownership. This is part of it. But I did not. Explaining would only invite argument, and I was done carrying that burden. As the days went on, my parents grew restless. My mom called 5 times one morning before sending a message that said, "Your sister is crying. You need to call her." My dad sent something similar, but with firmer wording. Fix this. You know how to. It was the closest he had ever come to admitting how dependent they were on me. I placed the phone on my dining table and stared at it until the screen went dark. That afternoon, a letter arrived at my apartment. It was forwarded mail from my old house, addressed to me but postmarked before the signing. Inside was a final notice from a lender regarding a business line of credit. It stated that unless the account holder provided updated information by a certain date, the guarantor would assume full responsibility. Only the signature on file was mine. With ownership now transferred, the responsibility had shifted legally to Chloe and Ethan. They would have to renegotiate or pay it off entirely. I sat with that letter in my lap, the corner of the paper digging lightly into my thigh. For years I had fielded these notices without a second thought. I had kept the business solvent through crises that would have folded a less disciplined company. I had juggled liabilities, timed payments, negotiated terms with lenders, who only offered patience because they trusted me to deliver. Chloe had no idea what any of that entailed. Ethan, even less. They believed ownership was the same as entitlement. They believed taking was the same as earning. As evening settled, my apartment grew dim. I turned on a single lamp and watched the warm light spread across the floor. It felt peaceful, almost sacred, the kind of peace that comes after a storm. Only this time the storm was not mine. My phone buzzed again around 9 at night. A voicemail this time, long and uneven. It was Chloe. Her voice was thick, as if she had been crying for hours. Clara, I do not know what to do. The bank said something about collateral. There are terms in these documents I have never seen before. Why did you sign off on all these loans? Why am I responsible now? Then a pause, following by the softest whisper. I thought taking over would be easy. I pressed my thumb against the phone and let the message end. It was not a victory. It was recognition. For the first time in her life, Chloe understood the weight she had taken, the weight she had demanded, the weight she believed she deserved. She was beginning to understand how heavy responsibility feels when no one is holding it for you. I stood up from the couch and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet, the porch lights glowing softly across the neighborhood. Cars were parked neatly along the curb, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Life went on, steady and unmoved by the unraveling happening inside my family. I closed the curtains and turned off the lamp. My apartment fell into darkness, but it was not an empty darkness. It was full of space, full of quiet that belonged entirely to me. Chloe had wanted everything I carried. Now she was finally starting to feel its weight. And that was only the beginning. The shift in my family's voice was one thing. The shift in the community around us was something else entirely. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like ours, not through announcements, but through small glances and hesitant greetings, the kinds of quiet signals people exchange when they sense something has cracked beneath the surface. It started with the HOA president leaving a voicemail that was clearly meant for Chloe, but somehow ended up in my inbox. He was polite, as he always was, but there was a strain in his tone. He said there were questions about the property taxes on the house and whether the new owners had submitted the required documentation. The way he said "new owners" made it sound like a title Chloe had not earned. I forwarded the message to no one. It was not mine to handle anymore. At the grocery store, I ran into a woman named Ruth who lived 3 houses down from my parents. We had never been close, but she had always smiled and asked how the business was going. This time she hesitated before approaching me. Her eyes flicked over my face, then away, then back again with uncertainty. "I heard something about your sister taking over your company. Is everything all right?" The question was gentle, but the curiosity beneath it hummed like static. I brushed my hair behind my ear and answered simply, "Everything is moving the way it needs to." Her eyes widened a little, as if she expected me to say more. When I did not, she nodded slowly. "Well, I hope things settle soon." People are talking. I pushed my cart forward without responding. Let them talk. By the end of that week, the whispers had grown legs. A supplier reached out to me directly, confused because Chloe had asked for extensions without providing any of the required reports. He assumed something was wrong with my health, as if the only reason I would step aside was physical incapacity. When I clarified that I was fine, simply restructuring, he fell into an uneasy silence. "Ah. Well, things have been a little unstable on her end," he said softly. "I thought maybe you already knew." I thanked him and ended the call. My silence, it seemed, was beginning to speak louder than anything I could have said. Saturday afternoon came with a string of phone calls from relatives I had not spoken to in months. A cousin in Houston reached out to ask if the rumors were true. An aunt in El Paso wanted to know why Chloe sounded so frazzled when she called her last night. Another relative sent a message asking if I had finally had a breakdown. The part that struck me most was how none of them asked how I was. Not one. Their questions were centered around the disruption of the familiar order. They wanted reassurance that I would step back into the role that kept everything functioning. They did not care whether that role had ever cost me anything. Later that evening, my mom called. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was rushed, anxious, carrying that same mixture of worry and frustration she always had when something did not go according to her unspoken script. "You need to talk to your sister. She is a mess. She says the bank is asking for things she does not understand. There are calls coming from vendors and some departments about a renewal notice. Your dad and I do not know what to do. Can you please handle this?" I leaned back against my couch, closing my eyes. Her words flowed out without a single pause to ask if I was doing all right. "Mom," I said quietly, "I cannot fix this for her." There was a sharp inhale on the other end of the line. "What do you mean you cannot? You have always known how to solve these things. That is the problem. Everyone expects me to handle everything. I am not stepping in this time." There was silence. The first real silence I had ever heard from her. Then, in a small voice, she said, "What are we supposed to do now?" I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. "You will have to figure it out together." Another breath, then she hung up without saying goodbye. An hour later, my dad called. His voice was deeper, steadier, but threaded with the discomfort he tried to hide. "Your mom is upset. Chloe is upset. Everyone is confused. Can we meet somewhere? Just you and me." I shook my head, though he could not see it. "Number 1, I do not think a meeting would help." He paused. "Clara, I know things got out of hand at New Year's. I know the way Chloe acted was wrong, but you stepping away like this is only making things worse. You have to understand the position we are in." I felt a strange calm settle over me. "Dad, I have always understood the position you were in. The question is, why no one ever tried to understand mine. There was another long silence. Then he exhaled softly, defeated. I will call you later. He did not. The next morning, the HOA president sent an email addressed to both Chloe and me, even though I no longer owned the house. He wrote that several neighbors had expressed concerns about overdue fees. He asked for clarification regarding the change in status and requested a meeting with the new primary owner. Chloe forwarded the email to me 3 times within an hour, each with a different message. One said, "Help me." Another said, "Why are they contacting me?" The last one said, "I do not know what any of this means." I let the messages sit. Later that day, while I was refilling my gas tank, a man who worked with Ethan at his previous job approached me. He recognized me from a company event 2 years earlier. He wiped his hands on his jeans and said he had heard Chloe and Ethan had taken over everything. His next words held a note of hard truth. "Ethan is in over his head." He said it like a plain fact, nothing more. I nodded. I know. He tilted his head, studying me. You stepping back was unexpected. He always made it seem like he could run things better than anyone else. Guess he is learning that talking big and doing big are 2 different things. There was no spite in his tone, just observation. When I got home, I found a message from my aunt, the one who had always loved gossip but disguised it as concern. She wrote that Chloe had been calling family members asking for advice and that many of them were now wondering why I refused to help. She ended the message with a thinly veiled reprimand. Family should stick together. For years, that sentence had been used like a leash. This time, I felt nothing. No guilt. No tugging inside my chest. Just clarity. Families should stick together, not lean entirely on one person until she collapses. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the apartment buildings, I stepped out onto my balcony. The air carried the faint smell of grilled meat from a neighbor's barbecue. A couple walked their dog along the sidewalk, their conversation drifting upward in soft, unintelligible murmurs. Life continued. Ordinary and unbothered. Inside, my phone sat on the kitchen counter. It vibrated every few minutes with messages I did not need to read. I stared at it for a long while, feeling something settle deeper inside me. My silence was not passive. It was not avoidance. It was a boundary. And that boundary was doing something I had never been able to do with words alone. It was revealing people for who they truly were. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder around Chloe. Vendors questioned her decisions. Neighbors gossiped about the overdue fees. My parents stopped attending their usual community gatherings because they were tired of answering questions they did not know how to answer. Chloe and Ethan isolated themselves in that house they had claimed, their lights on late into the night as they tried to sort through documents they did not understand. Meanwhile, the world around me softened. People stopped looking at me as the solution to every problem. Some avoided me because they did not know what to say. Others approached with a different kind of respect. Careful, uncertain, aware that something had shifted. The strangest part was how free I felt. The distance created by my silence was not cold. It was liberating. One evening, as I sat on my couch reading, I realized that I had not spoken to anyone in my family for several days. No calls, no texts, no desperate requests. And for the first time in my adult life, that absence did not feel like abandonment. It felt like space, like air. I closed my book and rested my head against the cushion. For years I had tried to explain myself, to justify my exhaustion, to defend my choices. None of it had ever changed anything. But my silence, the simplest action of all, was now unraveling a lifetime of assumptions. Sometimes you do not have to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes you simply stop speaking, and the truth speaks for you. I let that realization settle inside me as the room darkened around me. A quiet pause before everything shifted again. Silence had settled into my apartment like a soft layer of dust. Not heavy, not suffocating, just present. I sat with it for a while, letting the stillness stretch, noticing how different it felt now that I was no longer afraid of it. Then, slowly, life began to move again. Not through my family, but through the quiet mechanisms around us that never stop. Working. Systems do not care about loyalty or emotion or the stories families tell themselves. They only care about what is signed, what is filed, what is owed. It began with an automated email sent to the new registered owner of the company. The subject line was dry and absolute. Annual Compliance Review. Chloe must have received it before sunrise, because at 7 in the morning I found 3 missed calls from her. I did not listen to the voicemails. I deleted them, made coffee, and sat by the window while the steam drifted upward. By 8, another message appeared in my inbox addressed to both of us. Since she had taken over my position legally, all state reporting obligations now fell to her. The agency offered a reminder that these were required documents and that penalties could accrue if they were late. For years, I had handled those obligations as naturally as breathing, scheduling filings, responding to audits, updating corporate registrations. There had never been a need for panic because I had always been ahead of the curve. Chloe had never seen any of that work. She had only seen the part where everything looked smooth on the outside. That afternoon, Melissa, my CFO, sent me a short message. She wrote that the bank had reached out to the company and asked to verify continuity of management. She copied only the portion relevant to me. They wanted the updated signatures on the credit lines that supported our contracts. Since Chloe and Ethan were now listed as owners, the bank needed personal guarantees before releasing funds for the next cycle. I imagined Chloe reading those words, not realizing that the credit lines existed because the company required them, not because I had a personal interest in juggling balances. I had always paid down the lines as soon as revenue came in. Without that discipline, the system would tighten quickly. Later, another email came from the vendor who managed our warehouse logistics. It informed the new management that the previous payment terms were tied to my name and my reputation. The vendor needed fresh financial statements before extending the same flexibility. Again, nothing dramatic. Just the machinery of business doing what it always does, asking the next question, and then the next. I watched it all unfold from a distance. I did not interfere. I did not explain. There was a strange peace in letting the truth reveal itself without my voice, shaping it. 2 days later, I received a letter forwarded from my old office. It was from the IRS, routine but firm. The company's quarterly taxes were due within 14 days. Missing the deadline would trigger fines. Chloe and Ethan had no idea that payroll taxes and withholding required precise scheduling. They thought ownership meant access, not responsibility. I held the envelope for a long moment before setting it aside. Another system had begun moving in the background. Not legal. Not punitive, just procedural. A notice from the bank addressed to the property owner at the house Chloe had demanded. There were questions about insurance, escrow, and a discrepancy in the property tax assessment. Since the property had changed owners, verification was required. Again, Chloe had called me repeatedly. Again, I did not answer. The world was responding exactly the way it should. Not out of revenge, not out of malice. Simply following the chain they insisted on holding. While all of that churned quietly around me, I had my own appointment to keep. My doctor had called the previous week to schedule a follow-up, one I almost ignored. But something inside me knew I needed to close that loop, not for fear, but for clarity. So I drove back to the medical office, where 6 months earlier I had listened to. The words suspicious mass spoken gently, but heavily. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine-scented cleaner. A television played muted daytime news. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, feeling older than I was, but also steadier than I had ever been. When the nurse called my name, I followed her through the hallway to a small consultation room with pale blue walls. My doctor walked in holding a thin folder. He was calm as always, that same steady presence that had both comforted and frightened me half a year ago. He greeted me, sat down, and opened the folder. The latest scans look stable. The mass has not increased in size. The specialist reviewed the earlier imaging and believes the initial concern was based on shadowing. It is not uncommon. At this, I waited for some kind of emotional surge. Relief, joy, disbelief, something. Instead, I felt a quiet settling inside my chest, like a truth I already suspected was simply being confirmed. He continued talking, explaining follow-up intervals, possible next steps, what to watch for. But his voice softened as he studied my expression. Most patients would have smiled, cried, or exhaled deeply. He glanced at me with gentle concern. "Are you all right?" I nodded. "Yes, I am." He hesitated. "This is good news." I know, and I meant it. But it was good news in a different way than he assumed. Not because I feared dying, not because I had been waiting for a miracle. It was good because it told me the danger had never been in my body. It had been in the way I had let other people live inside my life, until there was no room left for me. The truth that washed through me was simple. I had not wanted to disappear because I was sick. I had wanted to disappear because the version of my life I had been living did not belong to me. When I walked out of the clinic and stepped into the warm Austin sunlight, the brightness felt almost symbolic. Not redemptive, not cinematic, just clear. For the first time in years, my future did not feel like a duty. It felt open. As I drove home, my phone buzzed once, then twice, then repeatedly. Messages from Chloe, from Ethan, from my mom, all variations of panic disguised as urgency. The system was pressing on them in ways they never anticipated. Responsibilities they thought would disappear had instead multiplied. At a red light, I opened one of the messages. It was an email forwarded from the bank. They were requesting updated financial documents and proof of liquidity. Without them, the lines of credit would be reviewed for suspension. I closed the notification and placed the phone face down. In my apartment, the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the blinds in neat, warm stripes. I set my keys on the counter, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the kitchen island. For years, the only feeling that mattered was what my family needed. Their anxieties became my obligations. Their disorganization became my endurance test. Every system that touched our lives filtered through me, because I made sure it did. Now those same systems were showing them what structure looks like when I am not, there to soften every edge. They were not being punished. They were simply being seen by the world exactly as they were. And standing there in the quiet, I realized something that made me feel rooted in my own skin for the first time. If the diagnosis 6 months ago had turned out to be accurate, I would have died never having lived a day for myself. That was the real danger. Not the illness, not the fear, the erasure. The thought was sharp but not painful, just true. I walked to the balcony and stepped outside. The air was warm against my face. The sky was painted with streaks of coral and soft gold. People walked their dogs along the sidewalk below. A couple laughed as they passed under the streetlight. A mother pushed a stroller while humming softly. Life was moving, and for once, I was choosing how mine would move with it. Behind me, inside the apartment, my phone buzzed again. I did not go back in for it. I did not feel pulled toward it. The world that once demanded every piece of me was still trying to call me back. But its voice sounded different now. Smaller. Less powerful. The real shift had nothing to do with the systems reviewing Chloe's new obligations or the responsibilities she had inherited. The shift was mine. The doctor's words echoed quietly in my mind. No indication of late-stage disease. I breathed in the warm air and let the meaning settle. I was not dying. But more importantly, I was no longer living someone else's version of my life. I stayed on the balcony until the sky dimmed and the streetlights flickered on, letting the quiet wrap around me again, steady and honest, before everything was set into motion once more. Chapter 8. I woke the next morning with a quiet sense of direction, as if my body already knew what needed to happen before my mind had fully caught up. The sky outside was a soft gray, low clouds settling over Austin in a way that made the whole city feel muted. I moved through my apartment slowly, made coffee, tied my hair back, and chose a plain navy blouse, something that made me look neither defensive nor apologetic. I was not going there to win anything. I was not going there to lose anything either. I was simply going to stand in the place they had dragged me into and acknowledge, out loud, that I no longer lived there. The bank sat on a corner in a polished 2-story building near North Lamar. I had walked in and out of that building for years, usually with a folder of documents in my hands and a plan to keep the company steady, no matter what the quarter looked like. Today I walked in with my hands free. I felt every step of it. The lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from thick carpeting and controlled air conditioning. A receptionist glanced up, recognized me, and gave a polite nod. She seemed unsure whether to smile, as if something in my face told her this was not a routine visit. I thanked her and asked for the conference room number. She pointed down the hallway, her eyes flicking for a moment with sympathy that surprised me. When I reached the door, I paused. Not to gather courage, just to acknowledge the stillness one last time before stepping back into the noise my family had created. Through the frosted glass, I could see vague shapes, a mix of movement and tension. I opened the door. Chloe was standing at the far end of the conference table. Her shoulders were tight, her hands flat against the glossy surface, as if she had been bracing herself there for a long time. Ethan sat beside her, pale, tapping one foot rapidly. Melissa stood near the window, her arms crossed loosely, watching everything with the kind of careful neutrality people develop after years of managing crises. A bank manager and a compliance officer sat across from them, their laptops open, expressions calm but firm. When Chloe saw me, something broke in her face. Not anger, not pride. Something between fear and recognition. "You came," she whispered. I nodded and took the empty seat closest to the door. Melissa gave me a small greeting. The bank manager cleared his throat and glanced at me politely. "Ms. Pearson, since the ownership transfer was completed, we are reviewing continuity of obligations. There are multiple active lines of credit connected to the business, and your sister and her husband need to provide updated guarantees to maintain them. There are also outstanding obligations related to the property you transferred. We understood it might be helpful to clarify a few details in person." He spoke gently, but his words landed in the room like slow falling stones. There was no accusation, just a fact. I felt the air shift around Chloe as she sat down across from me. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in presence. For most of our lives, she had created noise to fill space, assuming volume meant significance. Today, her voice came out thin. "Clara, can you please explain what all this is? I did not know there were loans. I did not know about these lines. Why are they tied to my name? Why is everything coming to me?" I folded my hands in my lap. I kept my tone steady. "Because that is what you asked for." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She looked toward the bank manager, then back at me. The panic rising in her eyes was unmistakable. Ethan cleared his throat. "We thought the company was more stable. We thought the house was free and clear. We thought," his voice cracked, "we thought you handled everything." Melissa shifted, and for the first time, she spoke. Her tone was professional but not cold. "She did. For years. That is why it always looked effortless. But ownership means you are the one who signs. It also means you are the one who is accountable." Chloe swallowed hard. She looked down at the table, and for a brief moment I saw the girl she used to be, desperate to be seen but unwilling to look at herself. "Clara." Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "Please, help me understand. Tell them something. Tell them I am not." She stopped and wiped her cheek. She had not cried when she demanded my entire life on New Year's Day. But now, in this room where her signature carried weight she never imagined, she could not hold herself together. The bank manager looked at her kindly. "We are not here to blame anyone. We simply need the updated documents. If you cannot provide them, we will have to reassess risk and adjust or suspend the accounts." Chloe looked at me again. "Clara, please. I am asking you as my sister." The words hit me like a soft, distant echo of something I used to wish for. She had not called me her sister in years. Not really. Not in any way that meant something beyond convenience. I leaned back in my chair and studied her face. The fear there was real. The desperation was real. But the relationship she was invoking was not. Not anymore. "Chloe," I said quietly, "I already gave you what you asked for." The room felt suddenly still. Even the air conditioner seemed to hush. She blinked, confused. "That is not what I meant. You know that is not what I meant. I just did not understand what I was signing. You always took care of these things. You always fixed everything. You cannot just leave me with all of this." I held her gaze, not as her older sister, not as her keeper, not as the designated problem solver of our family, but as a person finally stepping outside the walls she had built around me. "You asked me to sign over the house, the company, the assets, everything. You said the best gift I could give you was to be gone. So I honored that. These obligations were always part of the package. You did not see them because you never wanted to." Her breath caught. For a moment, I thought she might stand up or shout or push the blame somewhere else, the way she always had. But instead, she sank back in her chair, her hands trembling. "So that is it. You are just letting me drown." I shook my head. No. I am letting you stand where you insisted on standing. What happens next is between you, your husband, and the systems you asked to take control of. The compliance officer closed her laptop gently, as if to give space for the finality settling in the room. Melissa looked at me with quiet understanding. She had watched me carry every burden without complaint for years. She knew this moment was not cruel. It was released. Chloe whispered again. Clara, please. I did not mean for all of this to fall apart. I stood up. My chair made a soft sound against the carpet. Meaning has nothing to do with it. Choices do. I gathered my purse, nodded politely to the staff, thanked Melissa for her time, and turned toward the door. Behind me, Chloe's breath broke into a sound I had never heard from her. A mix of disbelief and something like grief. Ethan muttered something under his breath. Maybe a plea, maybe a curse. It no longer mattered. Before they could react, before they could reach for me again out of fear rather than love, I stepped out of the room. The hallway was quiet. The lobby is even quieter. I walked through it with a steady pace, feeling the carpet beneath my shoes, the cool air brushing my arms, the distant echo of voices from other offices. It struck me as I pushed open the glass door to the parking lot that my life had been stretched across rooms like this for years. Meetings where I fixed what others broke. Conversations where I softened what others hardened. Decisions where I protected people who never protected me back. Not today. Not anymore. Outside, the air was warm and bright. I took a slow breath, feeling the sun settle on my shoulders, and kept walking without looking back. I drove away from the bank without looking in the rearview mirror, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I already knew what was behind me. A life built on expectations I never agreed to carry. A family shaped by a version of me that existed only because they needed it. The sun was still warm on my shoulders when I reached my apartment, but inside I felt a different kind of weather, something quieter and steadier, like early autumn settling in after a long, choking summer. The days that followed were not loud. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouts left on my voicemail, no scenes in driveways or tearful apologies. Instead, everything unraveled the way real consequences do, slowly, through paperwork, deadlines, numbers, and the quiet persistence of systems that do not care about emotion. I learned about most of it indirectly, not because I went looking for it, but because the world has a way of moving information along even when you never ask. 2 mornings after the bank meeting, Melissa called. She never called for gossip, and she never spoke lightly about turmoil. She got straight to the point. Clara, they are selling the house. I let the words settle. It did not surprise me. Chloe had taken on more than a house when she demanded the title. She had taken on the insurance adjustments, the overdue property taxes, and the home equity line that had been used to stabilize the company during a tight year. The house has always been beautiful, but beauty does not pay its own bills. I asked how she knew. Melissa said one of the agents she worked with had mentioned a new listing that matched the description. She hesitated before adding that the price was lower than market value, a sign of urgency rather than strategy. Later that week, I heard the next piece from a former vendor who mailed a packet to my apartment out of habit. It included a notice of suspended credit terms addressed to the company under Chloe and Ethan's names. Without the financials or guarantees, their operations could not continue. From what I understood, several orders had already been canceled. By the end of that month, word reached me through a mutual friend that Chloe and Ethan were now meeting with a bankruptcy attorney. Their marriage had begun to strain under the pressure. Blame moves faster than accountability in households built on entitlement. Ethan had apparently accused Chloe of rushing into ownership without understanding anything. Chloe had reminded him that he had encouraged her, that he had told her she deserved everything I had. The friend added softly that their arguments had become loud enough for neighbors to notice. I listened quietly, thanked her, and did not ask for more. I did not want more. My own life began shifting in ways that felt both unfamiliar and natural. I started packing my apartment slowly, room by room, sorting my belongings with a clarity I had never had before. For years, I had built my living spaces around functionality and readiness, always keeping files accessible, always preparing for the next late-night call from Chloe, from my mom, from a supplier, from anyone who needed something solved quickly. Now I am packed with a different intention. I gave away half my furniture, donated boxes of clothes I had never worn, let go of old paperwork. I kept only what made me feel grounded, not important. When I told Melissa I was leaving Austin, she asked me where I was going. Somewhere smaller, I said. Somewhere quiet. She nodded. Her voice softened. I hope you give yourself a life that feels like yours this time. I rented a tiny cottage just outside of Fredericksburg. 1 bedroom, a porch with chipped railings, a small yard with a pecan tree that leaned slightly to the left. The rent was modest. The air felt clean. When I first unlocked the door, I stood in the living room for a long moment and listened to the silence settle around me. It was the kind of silence that did not expect anything from me. I spent my first days walking the neighborhood, passing houses with wind chimes and faded patio chairs, hearing the way the gravel crunched under my shoes. Sometimes I drove into town, bought fresh peaches from a roadside stand, or sat at a cafe with a book. Simple things that did not require me to solve anything. I kept my phone on, but I no longer checked it obsessively. Messages from my mom came in bursts, some short and clipped, some are long and anxious. She asked what she should do. She asked if I was coming back to talk to them. She asked if I had reconsidered. Once she wrote that my dad could not sleep. Another time she said that everything was falling apart. She never asked how I was. After a while, her messages stopped coming. One afternoon, my dad left a voicemail. His voice was tired. He asked if we could talk, just the two of us, but his tone held the same weight it always had. A plea for me to mend what others broke. I sat with the voicemail for a few minutes before deleting it, not out of anger, but out of recognition. I could not return to a role that had taken so much from me. A few weeks after settling into my new place, I took a long drive with no destination in mind. The Texas fields were golden under the late afternoon sun. I rolled the windows down, letting the warm air wash through the car. For the first time in years, I felt something uncomplicated. Not joy exactly, but peace. A quiet belonging to myself. Later that evening, while sitting on my porch with a cup of tea, I received a final message from Melissa. It was brief. They closed the company today. It is done. I stared at the screen until it went dark. There was no satisfaction in the news, no thrill of victory, no vindication, just a clean ending to something that had been fraying for years. The business had never been destroyed by me. It had simply been held together by my hands until the moment I stepped back. Not long after, I heard through a distant relative that Chloe and Ethan had put their marriage counseling on pause because they could no longer afford it. They were renting a small apartment on the edge of town. She had taken a job unrelated to any skills she once claimed to have. He was doing part-time work while searching for something stable. I did not follow their updates. People around me offered information out of habit, but I never encouraged. Whenever someone started to say their names, I found myself drifting away inside my own mind, already stepping towards something else. My world had grown smaller. Fewer people, fewer demands, fewer expectations. But in that smaller world, I felt something expand inside me. I cooked simple dinners. I took long walks at dusk. I learned how to be alone without feeling responsible for anyone's happiness. One evening, a soft rain fell across the fields. I sat by the window and watched it bead against the glass. The air smelled like wet earth and pecan wood. I realized then that for the first time in my life, I was not bracing myself for a call, not waiting for something to break, not preparing to catch someone else's fall. Silence had become my companion, not my punishment. And as I watched the rain slide down the window, I knew something with quiet certainty. Whatever happened to Chloe and Ethan no longer belonged to my story. I had walked away, and I was not looking back. The chapter ended there, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with a space wide enough for me to step into without carrying anyone else on my shoulders. The morning after the rain felt cleaner somehow, as if the air had rinsed off the last thin layer of obligation I used to wear like a second skin. I woke without an alarm, without a list waiting for me, without the familiar tightening in my chest that came from wondering who needed something from me before I had even had my first cup of coffee. Instead, I just lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the soft rustle of branches outside my window. My life felt smaller, but steady, like a house built on ground that finally belonged to me. I walked into the kitchen, barefoot on the cool tile, and started the coffee maker. The cottage smelled faintly of cedar from the night before, when I had opened the windows to let the rain-scented breeze move through the house. As the coffee brewed, I leaned against the counter and realized how strange it felt to not be waiting for my phone to ring. For so many years, the start of my day belonged to everyone except me. Now it was just mine. The quiet was not lonely. It was a kind of welcome. Outside the window, the sky was a pale blue brushed with wisps of white. A few cars moved slowly along the road beyond the pecan tree. A woman walking her dog waved to me across the yard, the same neighbor who had brought me a plate of muffins the week I moved in. People here did not know my history. They did not know the weight I used to carry. They did not expect anything from me except a hello. There was a freedom that I had never known. I poured a cup of coffee and sat on the porch steps. The wood was still slightly damp from the rain. A bird perched on the fence, puffing its feathers against the cool breeze. For the first time since New Year's Day, my mind drifted back to Chloe's voice, the way she had slammed those papers on the table and declared that the best gift I could give her was to be gone. At the time, it had felt like a cut, deep and familiar. Now I could hear it differently. She had given me a sentence that was meant to erase me. Instead, it had opened a door I had been too tired to find on my own. I had gone, yes, but not the way she wanted. Not in defeat, and not in silence born from fear. I had walked out of a life that was shrinking me and stepped into one that allowed me to breathe. Some days, when the wind is still enough, I can almost see the version of myself I used to be, moving from crisis to crisis, smoothing over every broken edge so no one else had to feel discomfort. I used to believe that made me useful, maybe even loved. Now I know it only made me invisible. I took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. The world was different when you were no longer bracing yourself for battle. Food tasted different. Time moved differently. Even breathing felt like something I was allowed to do slowly. A few weeks after I settled here, Melissa sent me one last update. Not about the company, but about her own plan. She said she was moving too, somewhere closer to her sister, somewhere with mountains. She thanked me for the years we worked together, for being steady when others were chaotic, for being fair even when it cost me. Her message was gentle, unburdened. It made me smile to think we were both walking toward lives that felt more ours. As for my family, they became quieter figures in the background of my thoughts. I did not hate them. I did not wish them harm. I simply no longer lived inside their expectations. Last I heard, Chloe and Ethan had separated for a time. Some said they were trying again. Others said they were done. The company was gone. The house was gone. Their marriage might have joined the rest of what collapsed under the weight of entitlement. But none of that belonged to me now. I had stepped out of that story and into one that did not require an audience. I began taking long drives on weekends, winding through the Texas hills, stopping when I felt like it, watching sunsets spill across the wide open sky. Sometimes I brought a journal, though I rarely wrote more than a few lines. It was enough just to sit in the quiet and know I was not expected to fix anything. At night, I cooked simple meals: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, soup that simmered for hours. I sat at my small wooden table and ate slowly, tasting every bite, not rushing to the next task. This was the first time in my life where time did not feel like something I owed someone. One evening, a cold front rolled in, and the wind rattled the porch railing. I sat on the couch with a blanket and watched the shadows move across the ceiling. My mind drifted back to my mom for a moment, the way she had looked at me on New Year's Day. Not with anger exactly, but with fear. Fear that without me, everything she depended on would collapse. I used to mistake that dependence for affection. Now I could see that love built on obligation is not love at all. It is a contract no one signs but you. I did not feel resentment, just distance, a soft letting go. The next morning, I walked along the country road near my cottage. The air was crisp, and the grass sparkled with dew. For a moment, I paused and watched the sunlight catch on the leaves. I realized something so simple it almost made me laugh. The best gift I ever gave myself was leaving. Not disappearing, not running. Leaving. By choice. On my own terms. Not because I was pushed, but because I finally understood that staying in a life that diminished me was not loyalty. It was self-abandonment. I returned to the porch and sat down again with a fresh cup of coffee. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed. A dog barked. A truck rumbled in the distance. Everyday sounds. Ordinary sounds. But they felt like a kind of music because none of them asked anything from me. As I watched the morning unfold, I felt a quiet truth settle inside me. Chloe had told me the best gift was when I was gone. She meant it as a dismissal, a way to claim space she believed belonged to her. But in the end, she had unknowingly given me something I had never been brave enough to take. A doorway out. A chance to live without performing. A life where my existence did not require justification. I finished my coffee and set the mug beside me. The breeze picked up again, carrying the scent of cedar and rain-washed earth. It felt like a blessing in a way, soft and unceremonious. Before I go, let me say this. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from. I stayed on the porch a little while longer, letting the quiet settle around me, steady and warm, before stepping fully into the day ahead.